Welcome to this webcast on the neo-smart economy, smart processes, and smart data. My name is Michael Herman, and I'm an independent blockchain developer who focuses primarily on the Neo blockchain platform. I also curate the Neo-C# Developers Center of Excellence. The Neo-C# Developers Center of Excellence is a GitHub project, an umbrella project for a number of open source projects designed to help C#, .NET, and Visual Studio developers create enterprise applications on the Neo blockchain. What is the Neo Smart Economy? There's three primary components. The first starts with digital assets, the crypto assets, such as the native currencies on the Neo blockchain, Neo and Gas, as well as the new tokens that can be minted on the Neo blockchain. It also consists of smart contracts, which is essentially code that is stored on the blockchain and executes on the blockchain against data that lives on the blockchain. And finally, the concept of digital identity. About a month ago, Malcolm characterized this quite succinctly with the statement that the Neo Smart Economy is about a world where the boundaries between real assets in the physical world and digital assets in the digital world have been removed. Let's look into that a little more deeply. Let's think deeply about the Neo Smart Economy. Today, we have the ability to transfer tokens from one address or one wallet to another, to another, to another. Whether that be an NEP5 token on the Neo blockchain or an ERC20 token on the Ethereum blockchain. There's no inherent business value being created here. Either the value of those tokens is being exchanged is spiraling up, or the value of those tokens is spiraling down. And that's the extent today, really, of the cryptocurrency market. But what people and businesses really need, or what they really want, is the ability to enact business processes, to enact those business processes on the blockchain. For example, being able to create and submit a timesheet or an expense report, have that expense report being reviewed, approved, rejected, or perhaps rerouted to someone else, but ultimately to ultimately be paid for the hours in the timesheet or the expenses in the expense report. And to do that in a way that's trustful, to do that in a way that can be recorded for prosperity. And the way to do that is through the smart contract. And when we think about the data that represents the requisition and the data that represents the state of the workflow, we call that smart data. So instead, on the left of just having the transfer of tokens from one address to another, we actually end up with many different kinds of assets being exchanged. So at the top, we could be creating and submitting what we generically would call a requisition. You want that requisition to be approved, rejected, or rerouted. And finally, we want to drop back into the world of tokens and get paid. And this concept is something I call smart processes. So again, just looking at it in a little more detail, each of the actors in the workflow has an address. On the top left-hand corner, the requester, the person who creates the requisition, creates that on the blockchain with the support of a smart contract at the bottom. Once that requisition has been created, then they can submit it. They can cause it to be enacted through the business rules, the business process that's encoded in that smart contract. That will then be routed in a virtual sense to the other players in this workflow, the other actors. It might be an accounts payable clerk who ultimately has to pay for the requisition. Again, they pay for the hours worked or paid for the expenses in the expense report. But it also may involve an approving manager, depending on the value of the requisition. So at the bottom here, we can see, for example, that the smart contract might automatically have a business rule that automatically pays any expenses or any hours worked with a value of less than $100. Alternatively, if it's more than $100 but less than $500, maybe the business rule and the business rules can be changeable. It simply needs to be routed to the accounts payable clerk who initiates the payment. Or alternatively, if it's more than $500, maybe it has to go to a supervisor or an approving manager who either approves or rejects the requisition, routes it, in the case of approval, to the accounts payable clerk, and then ultimately pays the requester through the smart contract. So this is a smart process embedded in a smart contract, and the combination of the smart contract and the data we refer to as smart data. On the right are some use cases. I've mentioned expense reports and timesheets, but there's many, many other requisitions that can use this same generic process and this same generic smart contract. Contribution reports, lottery tickets, loyalty points, discount coupons, vouchers, redemption of stock certificates and other kinds of certificates, and other forms of disbursements. The list is almost endless, and this is one of the most common types of workflow processes found in the world today. So let's talk a little bit more about this concept of smart contracts and smart data. So in the center, we refer to non-fungible entities, which I'll define on the next slide. But it's the idea that these are business entities, and some of the elements or fields of these business entities are non-fungible. They're non-mutable. So things like a specific ID or an account number or a reference number for the requisition. So the non-fungible entity would be the requisition, and the immutable field might be the requisition for the ID for the requisition, and most certainly the amount or the value of the requisition. We want those encoded on the Neo blockchain. And then we want to make that data smart. We want to wrap it with code. We want to wrap it with a smart contract. So here's some examples of the non-fungible entities in the NEP5R specification, the extension to NEP5 that supports the processing of requisitions, in addition to the normal processing of Neo tokens. So at the top, we see the entities that are used to represent tokens. In the smart contract, we see requisitions, contributors, approval roles, accounts payable roles. Because the requisitions themselves will generally be like PDF files or Excel spreadsheets or an XML document, there's going to be a need to store those off-chain. So there'll be a concept of public-private key management involved in the smart contract. The workflow state, user credentials, and different counters for tracking collections of entities within the smart process. So this combination of the non-fungible entities wrapped or embedded in a smart contract needs to be exposed to line of business applications, to enterprise business applications. So here we see the operations that the smart contract, the NEP5R smart contract, needs to respond to. Notice that these are higher level business oriented terms like create, submit, approve, reject, reroute, pay, register, and get. And then finally, we'll need the standard NEP5 operations for managing the transfer of tokens. The non-fungible entities, the smart contract that exposes business level operations. Collectively, we refer to that as smart data. So just to drill down a little bit more on what a non-fungible token is and a non-fungible entity. So Joe Stewart recently competed in the Microsoft Distributed Application Competition and won a third place prize. And for the Hush Puppies DApp. And in the GitHub repository, he has a Neo non-fungible token template written in Python. And in part of the documentation for his project, he uses these words. A non-fungible token can be thought of like a property deed. Each one carries a unique and immutable address, for example, the physical address of the property. And although there's other information, such as the owner of the property, there's certain immutable information that needs to be stored, essentially read-only fields that need to be stored as part of that token. The physical address is named, perhaps the the dimensions of the property, the amount of footage, etc. So an NFT smart contract then is useful for tracking the ownership of real-world items and can also be used in online gaming to allow users to possess unique characters or characteristics that are of limited supply and being able to transfer those between users. So how is a non-fungible entity different from a non-fungible token? The non-fungible entity is a generalization. It's any persistable entity on the Neo blockchain, any persistable entity on the blockchain that has one or more read-only properties or fields that cannot be changed once the entity has been created. So one or more non-mutable properties. So it's not just about tokens, it's about any entity you choose to describe and represent on the Neo blockchain. And if we think back to those use cases that we talked about earlier, expense reports become non-fungible entities, timesheets, contribution reports, over on the right, money orders or other kinds of disbursements, stock certificates. Other than the ownership of the stock certificate, basically all of the fields and properties of the stock certificate would be immutable. So we take the concept of non-fungible token and generalize it to a non-fungible entity. Further, when we think about just business process automation in general or workflow, we're reminded that the most common document lifecycle management scenarios, in fact, like expense reports and absentee report submission, are the most common types of workflows you'll find. Tracking workflows and routing and approval workflows. So the future, the opportunity for the NEP5R smart contract, and the ability for it to be generalized to support all of these examples can be a pretty powerful concept for the neo-smart economy. Here's an example from a recent enterprise workflow assessment that was conducted for a mid-size American company. They had an audit or an analysis performed of 70 of their workflows, and they found that 55 of them were found to be of the simple routing and approval variety, just like we talked about for NEP5R. 15 of the workflows had more than 5 actions or steps representing more complex scenarios. So this met the company's expectation of, the 80-20 rule that often applies to workflows, where 80% of the workflows are of the simple routing and approval variety. And to quote Joel Olson, a SharePoint architect involved with this project, in a typical enterprise, 80% or more of forms and document workflows are of the simple routing and approval variety. So the previous discussion probably invites the question, should I be using blockchain technology? Should I be using smart contracts and smart processes and smart data for every little business process? And the answer is no. The following are 4 questions you should ask yourself about your project. And after we look at the 4 questions, we'll delve a little bit deeper into when and where to use blockchain technology. So the first question is it a business process that crosses trust boundaries? Remember the very nature, one of the very most important principles of blockchain technology is that data and information, transactions encoded in the blockchain are immutable. And this creates the opportunity to create processes that cross trust boundaries, cross organizational boundaries, that exist between 2 people who don't know each other, and being able to have that business process enacted in a trustless way. And that's a very unique characteristic of the blockchain. Do multiple parties manipulate the same data? So this is around the theme of decentralization. That the blockchain lives out on the internet. It lives in the nodes of the blockchain infrastructure. Anybody can run a node. Anybody can have a copy of the blockchain. And when multiple parties are manipulating or working with the same data, it's hugely beneficial from a trust perspective and from an infrastructure and logistics perspective to have that data available so that each party can read the data, enact the business process, have those changes being replicated to the other copies of the blockchain, and maintaining the trustless characteristics from the first question. You should ask yourself, are processes operating inefficiently or are decisions being delayed due to the number of intermediaries involved in the process? Lots of commercial processes today and government processes today are inefficient and take too long to complete because of the number of intermediaries that are involved in the process. Think of selling and buying a house. Each party has a lawyer. The lawyers are working with multiple banks. The banks are dealing with multiple mortgages. There's multiple people in the bank. There might be multiple people in the law firm. All of these people are contributing to inefficiencies and delays. And lastly, does the business process involve low value manual verification steps. Manual verification steps that can be easily automated. So in the case of the routing of the expense report through the NEP5R smart contract, if the expense report is for a small amount, less than $100, why not just pay it? You have a complete ledger, complete distributed ledger represented by the blockchain of that submission, of that requisition. And if anything were to go wrong, or if the submitter was to have, fraudulently or inappropriately submitted that requisition, there's a complete record of it. And something like the NEP5R smart contract could be further enhanced to take into account, for example, reputation and trust level as one of its business rules. But if we're going to use blockchain technology, it's ultimately about having trusted relationships in a trustless way, and you should be able to remove low value or manual verification steps, such as the routing of an expense report for payment. So use blockchain technology when there's a need for real-time transparency by connecting business processes across organizations, by spanning these trust boundaries. When you want real-time and transparent access to a verifiable single source of the truth across organization boundaries. When you want to introduce trust and increase efficiency amongst the participants, reducing the need for the intermediaries that are creating inefficiencies and creating delays. And lastly, the improved efficiencies and increased confidence that results through the automation and the smart contracts that execute these business processes consistently and reliably. If you can answer yes to these 4 questions, and depending on the complexity of your business process, it's quite likely that the NEP5R smart contract can benefit your business process. Here's a recent reminder from Gartner. Use blockchain technology when it matches the requirements of your application. Don't automatically use blockchain technology simply because you're replatforming an existing application. So if you're just moving it from Windows to Unix or Unix to Windows, that's not a reason to use blockchain technology. It's an opportunity to consider using blockchain technology, but unless you can answer yes to these 4 questions, don't automatically introduce blockchain technology simply because you're replatforming an existing application. So just to wrap up, think more deeply about the neo-smart economy. Think about smart data. Think about smart business processes. Take the idea of tokenizing every little thing, which is really around smart data, and perhaps you want to extend that to tokenize every little business activity. But to tokenize every little business activity, you go full circle. You have to tokenize every little thing. So it's how do you represent the actors and the elements of a business process as entities? How do you encode the business rules and business processing of those entities in a smart contract? How do you surface the capabilities of that smart contract in higher level business language, the operations that are exposed by the smart contract? So if you have any questions, or comments or feedback, you could email me at neotoronto@outlook.com. I'm also in the Neo Discord channel, usually several hours a day. You can also reach me on Facebook. You can reach me on LinkedIn. I'd appreciate receiving your feedback.